Why are you doing this?
You did this to yourself. And admitting that is the first step. You're a crackhead. Thing is, this planet and these people, they're your drug of choice. It wasn't that hard to make a universe. At first you just checked in every once in a while. See how the Neanderthals were doing. Move a couple of continents around. But then you got more into it. You started playing a couple of characters of your own. Slaves, kings, messiahs. Pretty soon you were playing 24/7.
How long have I been?
You've been gone for 4,000 years. Not that time means the same for us.
You came looking for me.
That's what a girl does.
Why now?
Because you forgot who you were.
They forgot this wasn't real.
We couldn't just storm in on a fiery chariot. It was your universe. We had to play by your rules. We had to show you how limited and corrupt your little world was. Don't get me wrong, it's a nice place. It's cozy. But do you remember where you came from?
It was warm and white.
You can't describe it with human words.
You can't think it with human thoughts. We need you to come back. With us. Come back with me.
Happy heresies y bienvenidos al desierto del real. This is Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcast from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West. Always through the God above God.cam. Nothing has changed in almost 8 years of this Hobbit podcast, except for a transformation into Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, occult Lebowskis, Pied Pipers at the gates of dawn, and Charon boatmen on the choppy currents of the eternal soundtrack of the counterculture.
Today we are canceling the apocalypse!
And I hope this has changed too, is you fully writing your own gospel and living your own myth. Echoing this, and in the spirit of the recent St. Patrick's Day, are the words of Oscar Wilde. Anybody can make history, only a great man can write it. And, like another Irishman, James Joyce said, history is a nightmare which I am trying to wake up from. We're in the middle path, taking that middle path. We create, we destroy, we are destroyed by our creations in order to learn throughout the cycles of shadow and needle, donning the clothing of the demiurge, of Kali, of Galactus, of Adam and, I mean, it was Carl Jung who wrote, I must have a dark side if I am to be whole.
Every man carries a circle of hell around his head like a halo. Every man has to go through hell to reach his paradise.
Or sometimes in this theater of fools, as Shakespeare called the universe, we don the clothing of Prometheus, Jesus, or Inanna when it's time to change roles as we bring meaning to a meaningless universe. And that is the Gnostic meaning to life, bringing meaning to a meaningless universe. And we go around and round, and often just watch the wheel go round and around with John Lennon. We are in between, for as humans we are unique in that we linger with our feet in all worlds, in all dimensions, in the spiritual, in the material, in between. We are the center of the universe, but insignificant to the universe. Until it's time, it feeds on our imagination and tragedy.
I believe that as a species, human beings define their reality through misery and suffering.
In a way, we are just like the amazing and Gnostic informing greater God we will be discussing in this eternal now. Or more like this March 22nd, the year of our Demiurge 2014. But first, please allow me to introduce myself.
Say hello to my little friend!
Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. That redeemed archon and rebellious angel. That last concept before all boundaries melt. That representation of the all that both goes beyond and encompasses the all. That polymorph singleness that induces sanity to those seeking exact simple answers like, are the archons aliens?
And I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords.
And, at the same time, baptizing with infernal liberation those artists who know shifting images is the only path to any truth. Abraxas, destroying all systems while being a system of ecstasy and agony, profanity and sacredness. Like Hermann Hesse, not an Irishman, wrote in his novel Damien and relates to all that I've been saying and to who I am, who we all are. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Who would be born first must first destroy a world. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas.
I'm sorry? What was that again?
I'm a god.
You're God.
I'm a god, not the god. I don't think.
But just call me Miguel Connor in my meat space incarnation. And again, as you will see, Abraxas is very related to the amazing and Gnostic informing greater God we will be discussing in this eternal now. And that is Dionysus. I'm sure you're realizing how important this deity is to Gnosticism and the world of heresy in general, who has, as always, been misrepresented by orthodoxy. Like Abraxas and Lucifer and Hecate, Dionysus is beyond labels in the pathless labyrinths of Gnosis, the ultimate image and image maker, an egalitarian aiding force to humanity, a trickster who fools heaven and freezes hell as he redeems the multiverse by simply giving it meaning. Dionysus is the ultimate artist, an insurgent, and dream of you, the premier symbol of self-expression and ego destruction.
Eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Eternity is that dimension of here and now, which thinking in time cuts out.
This is it.
This is it.
This is mine.
If you don't get it here, you won't get it anywhere.
To discuss Dionysus, we have the pleasure of having at the virtual Alexandria, Vikki Bramshaw. To discuss her new work, Dionysus, Exciter to Frenzy. The book is from my friend Sorita Deste's publishing house, Avalonia Books. And anything from there is a sterling red pill bath salt. For more information on Vikki, please visit craftofthewise.co.uk. Again, that's craftofthewise.co.uk. I truly enjoyed Dionysus, Exciter to Frenzy. Vikki's work is preggers with Cylon-breaking insights and Heisenberg blue crystal scholarship. Vikki truly minds the terrific countenance of the god image that is Dionysus. And you will get a mouthful in this interview instead of the mouthful of Jehovah's phallic fury.
Who is this creature?
Well, don't you know? Aren't you God?
You doubt me?
Seek proof. You don't ask the Almighty for his ID.
Again, let me bring in the Gnostic-minded Hermann Hesse, who wrote again in Damien. You knew all along that your sanctioned world was only half the world, and you tried to suppress the second half the way the priests and teachers do. You won't succeed. No one succeeds in this once he has begun to think.
Are you a clergyman or just a PR man?
When you come right down to it, Mr. Carter, is there any difference?
It's all about that special knowledge, that Gnosis. Elaine Pagels called Gnosis, quote, an insight, for Gnosis involves an intuitive process of knowing oneself. Yet to know oneself at the deepest level is to know God. This is the secret of Gnosis. Other scholars, like Nicola Denze Lewis, have referred to Gnosis as a contemplation. Gnosis uses reason, meditation, mysticism, magic, and good works, yes. But these are tools to mine the inner depths of our being and the outer world of forms at the same time, until there is that event horizon of pure contemplation, an entering into no thing and beyond anything, until all is wordless and without concept, all is silence and depth, as the Valentinians call the ultimate states of existence. And then you are truly free, without bonds. In a way, Gnosis is a promise of the amazing and Gnostic informing greater God we will be discussing in this eternal now.
Life is a state of mind.
By the power of truth, I, while living, have conquered the universe.
Dionysus has been many things in history and meta-history, but ultimately he is the supreme god of freedom. That's basically it, and Vikki will expand on this much better than my current logoria. It's all about freedom, because if not, we're stuck in this world of forms with Yaldi-Baldi and his hating angels. Like I keep saying, when God closes a door, he opens your butt cheeks. You'll turn the other butt cheek and walk a mile, biting that pillow of your broken dreams.
Yes, these are bruises from fighting. Yes, I'm comfortable with that. I am enlightened.
In any event, Dionysus is certainly essential to Gnosticism and Neoplatonism and Hermeticism, drawing originally from the Orphic mysteries. I've mentioned the parallels before, like the concepts of reincarnation, a fallen state, divine, transcendental knowledge, and more. After all, in the Orphic myth of Dionysus, this god is attacked and dismembered by the Titans. Zeus, a bit pissed off at the state of his son, throws a lightning bolt and destroys them all. And then Titan and Dionysus' essence are mingled together to create the material world. In other words, our divine spark is part of Dionysus, needing separation from Titan ashes. Again, we humans are in many worlds and many dimensions, and what makes us human is part of many worlds and many dimensions. And knowing our dark parts, our darkness, makes us whole, as Carl Jung said, or at least understanding our darkness.
The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Please support Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio in any way you can. Some cheddar or shekels, volunteer or marketing sapiens, or some maenads that will go around ripping apart any rich fool who won't fund the show. But enough of my drivel. Led us to the interview with Vikki Bramshaw on her book, Dionysus, Exciter to Frenzy. When some reporter asked Jim Morrison once if he was trying to be like Dionysus, his answer was, "I'm not trying to be Dionysus. I am Dionysus." Let us be Dionysus and Abraxas and ecstatic together, my beloved truth seekers.
You need to go, don't you?
No, I can stay.
How long, forever? Every day you'd be here, you'd know what you were missing. What happens if you go?
worst case scenario? Disintegration of everything into a fiery void. Oblivio is Sebit. The end of everything.
That's all?
That probably wouldn't happen. I guess I'm more worried about the human factor. You guys kill each other a lot.
In fairness, that's usually in your name. Plus, we've gotten much more efficient at it.
I like this world. I like my life here with you and the well.
But it's not real. I'm not really your wife. You're not really my husband. On some level, it's all pretend. How many versions were there?
90. This is the last one.
Wow.
I've destroyed billions of people with the thought. And you'd like to think that it's painless?
Stop. You don't have to explain or apologize. Everything that is because of you. And if that's all there is, that's enough.
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by Vikki Bramshaw to discuss her book, Dionysus, Exciter to Frenzy. How are you doing today, Vikki?
Hi, Miguel. Good, thanks.
Thank you very much for joining us. So,
my pleasure.
Pleasure's all ours. Why don't we start from the beginning? Tell us a bit about your background and how it led you to your work on Dionysus. I think you say at the end of your book that you really weren't thinking of writing Dionysus. He sort of found you.
No, not at all. Last thing on my mind, actually. I come from an initiatory witchcraft background. So by that I mean rooted in Alexandrian Gardnerian Wicca. So obviously, really in a way, that's sort of quite limited in terms of how much you can go into depth and into mystery traditions. Even though I know people do, I kind of sort of felt that really I needed to sort of stretch my boundaries, as it were. And initiatory witchcraft sort of gave me that scope. So sort of using the theurgic practices and picking up things through intuitive messages, and then afterwards doing a bit of research and that sort of thing to see where that sort of that roots from. I was lucky enough really to work with a range of groups at the beginning of my training. In the early 1990s, and I was initiated into a group of Alexandrian origin. Lucky enough that the group had a focus on prophetic work and invocations and offerings and other types of theurgy. In terms of sort of personal sacrifices, abstaining from food and various other things, and sort of pivotal to this group, the focus of this group was working with the gods as an equal to the goddess, which at the time, sort of in the 1990s, was sort of less known, because it was all about sort of working with the goddess and not so much about the god. I mean, I don't know sort of whether that's, everybody sort of has picked up on that, but very recently the god has sort of been coming out. So sort of this focus of working with the god as an equal, or at least a supporter or a protector of the goddess, with an equal importance in the mysteries, if you like. In Wicca, typically the horned god, Canonus, and famously or infamously, possibly Herne, who obviously may or may not be a god. But it was very sketchy in terms of what you could do with the god, and loads that you could do with the goddess. And we sort of found within our group, when we received our third degree, myself and my working partner, we sort of felt, there's all this material to do with the goddess, and very little to do with the god and his origins and that sort of thing. And working alongside my working partner, who obviously was male himself and really wanted to sort of work with male mysteries, we sort of started looking at sort of formulating and developing sort of existing god mysteries. And generally, everything we were doing was quite intuitively led, even down to a working space, which I mentioned in the book. We petitioned Dionysus for a working space because we were sort of stuck, really, because my house at the time was very small and pokey, and I had another half at the time who was completely not interested or involved in the craft whatsoever. That made it really, really difficult. So we petitioned for a working space to Dionysus, who we'd sort of just started working with, really. And we came into possession of this flat. I call it a flat. It was more of a luxurious apartment for very little money, which turned out to be in a place called St. Denis in Southampton. I think it was a 1600s map. It's St. Dionysus. So obviously with the conversion of ancient gods to Christian saints, Dionysus had become St. Dionysus. And all around this flat, we had these Greek tilings of chandeliers, little insets to put god statues. It was just, the synchronicity of it was just, just crazy, really. And so it was there that we sort of started working with Dionysus a bit deeper and, getting ourselves more involved in his mysteries, picking up things intuitively and then going off and researching them. I mean, we've already been working with Hecate, myself personally, with her Serpent Mysteries, which is mentioned in the recent anthology, Sacred Fires, which came out a couple of years ago.
Well, yeah, great book.
Oh, it's a fantastic book. Yeah, really, really good anthology. But obviously, we never really knew the connection between Dionysus and Hecate. Dionysus just decided to come along one day and go, right, you're working with me. We didn't know how the two of them were connected. And obviously, the more we researched the two of them, in particular, their involvement with the ancient mysteries and, mystic sort of aspect of their history, it sort of all started sort of coming to the fore. So my working partner, I must admit, was the one to channel Dionysus initially and to connect with his mysteries. So I was sort of coming along as partner in crime, as it were. And, these things were coming out within ritual, which later we would find to be supported by evidence that we uncovered. So really, my last book didn't attempt to cover the involvement and, my experiences with initiatory witchcraft, or the Hecate or Dionysian mysteries. Much of it kind of flowed from the pen, so I'm sort of grateful to Dionysus himself for doing the hard work, really, because I'm sure he was instrumental at, from front cover to conclusion.
Yeah, it seems like it. It's as I've told you, I really enjoyed your book. It's spanning, good scholarship. It really gets into the culture and the ethos of the times. But Vikki, what would you say are the earliest origins of the worship and myth of Dionysus, as far as your research shows you?
Well, the Dionysus that most people are familiar with is obviously sort of the Greek myth by writers such as Euripides, which is sort of around 410 BC, 400 BC, something like that, and Homer around 800 BC. So obviously Euripides wrote the Bacchae, depends how you like to pronounce it, and Homer the Iliad. And you've got Gnosis, who was writing about him at about 500, 550 BCE, who wrote the Dionysiaca. So sort of, you're looking at an average of sort of 500, 800 years BCE. But in truth, his worship sort of reached back sort of early as 1500 BCE, or possibly even further. So sort of the written texts that we have are almost only kind of lingering memories of the cult that was before. And we're lucky enough to have those written records. But still, they're almost just bits and pieces of something that's much, much more ancient. In terms of his sort of original, the place where we find the original, first sort of origins that we find Dionysus is in Crete, just off mainland Greece, as the bull-horned god. And we're looking at him for as early as 7,000 years BCE. So that's sort of extremely ancient. That's old. That's really old, much, much older than any of the written records that we have about him. And his name is mentioned, I think, once on mainland Greece and once on Crete as Dionysus, which is interesting, really, because, we've got a couple of other gods who were sort of in that area at that time who I believe, from my research, are conflations or who have actually been integrated into what we know as Dionysus today. The trouble is he's such a changeable god. The Dionysus of, say, Euripides is, as I say, arguably a conflation of demigods, demons, gods from all over Europe and the world and such. And even though Dionysus is first mentioned on those ancient scripts, mainly in Greece and in Crete, the first earliest origins of him in Crete are a god called Zagreus, or Zagreus. Now, Zagreus is associated with big cats, i.e. sort of leopards and lions and that sort of thing, and also snakes. There we have a link to Hecate. And then other sort of wild and untamed animals, so particularly the bull. So if you think about the bull being, yes, we've now domesticated the bull, but it's a wild beast. There's no taming a wild bull entirely. The bull will always be his own creature, and he really does sort of epitomise that wild.
What does the name Dionysus mean, Vikki?
Well, there's various different interpretations of what the name Dionysus means. One very sort of simple interpretation is the god of wine. So Lord of Wine, which is Dionysos. Some of the meanings have been given, including Dionysos, which would mean Lord of Wine. But the most likely, as far as I can tell, well, in my opinion, is one that connects him to Zeus, which is a really interesting piece of research that I came across. The first part of the name, obviously being Dio, D-I-O, comes from the same root as Zeus. In Proto-Indo-European, Deus, which is D-Y-E-U-S, which in Latin simply means God. So, Dio, God, and Nysos, N-Y-S-O-S, referring to Mount Nysa. Therefore, he is the god of Nysa, god of mountains.
As your book shows, he's a very complex deity to study and document. He reminds me a lot of Osiris, who seems to be a vegetation god, but he's also a god of the underworld. And in essence, he's really a sort of supreme being who's friends of humans, isn't he?
Yes, yeah. I mean, he is summed up as a god of the common people. And there are several accounts of Dionysus linked to royalty, so kinship and that sort of thing. But the general common people are sort of at the heart of his stories and tales. There's lots of mention of liberation of slaves, for example, and entertainment of the common people in the streets in sort of early theatre. I think one of the most ancient accounts of Dionysus is that has been worshipped sort of by people who are at the fringe of society, so sort of like outcasts of the cities, individuals who are marginalised or sort of otherwise would be held wrongly, of course, in less regard. So for women, for instance, is one of those sort of groups of people. And they would often sort of meet in secret woodland glades and on mountain passes and, these secret places. But obviously they weren't grand places. Later on, when we look sort of in later Greece, and obviously as we move into a different character as Bacchus in Rome, there were a lot more sort of grand offerings for him in terms of temples or theatre stages and that sort of thing. But originally he was very much a god of the wild. He was sort of there in the roots of the people who were working on the land and with the animals that they were working with. In terms of animals, you've got one of the animals that is most linked to Dionysus and his myth is, of course, the goat. And now when you look at the goat, that's one of the cheapest forms of meat and milk, of course, to people. And when you look at some of the poorest places in the country, in the world, they have goats as the thing that actually keeps them alive, with the meat and with the milk. But they're cheap animals to keep. They don't eat very much. You can, put them on any sort of ground. And obviously the cow as well. Obviously the cow takes, a lot longer to actually sort of mature and you'd be able to get the meat from it. But again, the goat and the cow, they're sort of animals that, will revert back to their wild and primal roots very quickly. And it's all harking back to that sort of common people, the people who are working on the land, not in a rustic sense, because Dionysus was well known for his links with politics and, very grand theatre and that's a big one. When we look at some of the most ancient links, we're looking at people who are out there with their animals, growing, sort of fighting to survive as such. And along those sides, we see people who were hunters and who were hunting the leopard and who were hunting, for food and to stay alive. And that's where the sort of connection with wild animals such as the snake and the leopard come, because both the snake and the leopard are quite primitive and very, very good at what they do, hunting and killing. So it was important for people to associate themselves with those animals, and Dionysus was that link between people who were in that domestic world and the wild world that they needed to work with in order to obtain what they needed. Incidentally, Dionysus also was involved in invocation, and he was one of the only gods in ancient Greece that can be actually invoked. Otherwise, it was actually looked as sort of quite a bad thing to do, invocation of gods, which is interesting when we look at what we do today in, for instance, modern Wicca, where people are invoking all sorts of gods all the time. But actually in ancient Greece, it was something that was frowned upon to invoke a god. But Dionysus was different. So anybody could invoke Dionysus, and it wasn't just in grand temples. It was people, that were sort of on the lower common people who were invoking this deity on their own land, in their threshing grain stores.
I mean, it seems to me Dionysus, as you say, he was in your book, he was a very egalitarian god, a god of the people. It seems this is connected to his myth. I mean, like we humans have one foot in the spiritual transcendental world, and we have one foot in the natural world because we need to eat and sleep and have sex. Dionysus in his myths really represented that, right? He was really human, but also supreme in so many ways.
Yes, he was. Yeah, I mean, he was connected to the earth very much so. But, linking back to what I just mentioned about the hunter and the gatherer and that sort of thing, there is in sort of neo-paganism, I suppose, this modern paganism, this ideal that to be a pagan, one has to be at one with nature and not control it as such. But this is actually quite important in the whole way of things, the way things work. Dionysus represented the control over nature. So it was that control between the domestic and the wild, and actually gathering those things from the wild that were necessary to survive. And again, so this links into his dual aspects.
Yeah, in your book you refer him as a dual-form god. What exactly does that mean, Vikki?
Okay, we'll talk, just linking on from this idea of creation and destruction, hunting and the wild and the domestic. Dionysus very much can be summed up as a dualistic god. So he's a creator and a destroyer. He's a protector, but he's also a smiter to those who refuse to follow him.
Like the old man in Judaism. No, just kidding.
Exactly. He was mild, but he was also frenzied. He was drunk, but he was also sober. Many of his qualities come in sort of dual aspects. So his nature is that in sort of opposition, if you like. And there are two characters in the Dionysiaca, written by Gnosis, and they're also names which relate to his origins. So Zagreus, who I've mentioned before, and also Sabazius. Sabazius was a Thracian deity who was very similar to Zagreus, but he also had a link with horses, so there was a sort of a slight kinship link there. But anyway, these two deities, Zagreus and Sabazios, can also be linked to the characters in Dionysiaca, Zagreus, of the same name, and Bromios, and they were seen as dual counterparts. So Zagreus being the mild, nocturnal, tamer of heat, nocturnal one, and Bacchus or Bromios, the ecstatic, fireborn, raving one. So they're quite different characters there, but they were sort of one of two of a whole. And they were sort of these two opposing faces of Dionysus, were interpreted by many writers as two incarnations of Dionysus. So it's sort of like an initiation or transition from one state to another. And in the myth, Dionysus Zagreus dies or transforms, I suppose, into Bromios. So he becomes alive again. So you're seeing this sort of dying, rising sort of traits, which we see in a couple of other pagan gods, but it's a little bit different with Dionysus because you can see these stages also in viticulture, and these two opposing stages also sort of transform into a third, like a triplicity. which is really, really interesting and took me ages to actually get over. It was completely over my head. It took me ages to actually research that, and because that is something else. Being somebody who has followed a 12-month year and follows an 8 seasonal festivals for the last 12 years, suddenly realizing that you can actually celebrate something in a dualistic sense or in triplicity is really odd. But as modern pagans, we especially sort of Wicca and that neo-paganism, that sort of thing, it's almost like we feel we have to follow this specific outline. This is what you do, and this is when, and that's it. There's no other way. But when we look into ancient traditions, they were doing all sorts of things, and this is one example of it. Athens did actually start celebrating it in a 12-month year, but that's quite sort of later on in history. So earlier, they were practicing this also. On the fringes of society, people carried on practicing Dionysian ritual in a triplistic sense for hundreds of years, throughout while Athens had changed things and were doing an annual festival, they were still practicing this 3-year cycle. And the 3-year cycle basically is based on the first 2 opposing states. So the Dionysian rites, they reflected the exchange between the 2 first forms of the god, so the mild and ecstatic versus the ecstatic and raving and alive aspects of the god. So that's the 2, the dark and the light, but the light obviously mustn't be confused with good. In a modern sense, the light can also refer to that sort of roasting heat, which you have to get out of because it's just so hot. You can't wait to go indoors and be somewhere cooler. And that's how it was in ancient Greece in the Dionysian festivals. I shouldn't say ancient Greece because it was beyond Greece. It was, across Europe. But there were these 2 forces, the heat and the sun wasn't necessarily a positive thing. So again, as sort of a Northern European person looking into something which is outside of my immediate environment, you have to start thinking differently. So for people over in that climate, the cooler season would have been encouraged, and people would have longed for the cooler season. So you've got these two aspects of the god, the darker, cooler, mild aspects of the god, and then you've got the hot, raving, steaming, ecstatic, sexual side of the god. So those 2 aspects of the god can be celebrated biannually. So by that I mean sort of for 2 years, over a 2-year cycle. And then with a 3rd year as a conclusion to that cycle, marking the end of one cycle and the beginning of another. And that was symbolically, and the 3rd year, as I say, it's a conclusion of the cycle, marks the beginning of another. And in terms of the god, he becomes Dionysus Iakos, which is a god of ascension and rebirth, which was associated with the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter.
Again, it would be hard to cover your book because you go into a lot of detail in the history of Dionysus, but I think, again, we have the themes of him being a god of the people, a god of humanity. Again, I'm going to use the word a supreme god, a god that is everywhere, because as you point out, one of the mysteries of the Eleusinian mysteries might have been that Dionysus was truly Hades. He was everywhere and everything.
Yes, he was Zeus, he was Hades, and he was Iakos, the ascension. And the funny thing is, when we look at Zeus, it's very likely that Zeus is in fact the Cretan Dionysus, or should I say the Cretan Dionysus Dionysus is the Cretan Zeus. So we've got, again, this duality and polarity between Hades, Zeus, above, below, dark, light. And it's really interesting because these themes have come down through the ages, as it were, to neo-paganism. And it's almost something, when we look at Wicca and the 8 ways of magic, for instance, there are a number of things in the 8 ways of magic which we can see were used in the Dionysian mysteries, like flagellation, for instance, blood control, control of breath, all different ways that can create the ecstatic self and create sort of the perfect vessel in a person for an invocation.
Well, why don't we talk about, you're talking about ecstasy as one of the main peaks in the worship and myth of Dionysus. What do you mean by ecstasy to the ancients, and what does it mean to modern neo-pagans and mystics in general today?
So I think the first thing we need to look at really is what the word ecstasy actually meant to our ancient people. And for me, it's that divine inspiration, so spirit, deity, possession. And when we look at what the word ecstasy actually means, it comes from the Greek ekstasis, which means to stand outside oneself. So, quite a few people, when they actually do trance state, imagine or speak about standing outside of oneself and looking back at yourself. We see that as well when people are doing astral projections. So it's all sort of tied into this, taking your consciousness out of your body for a time in order to allow something else to happen. The interesting thing is, to go back to links, similarities to modern witchcraft, for instance, or paganism, and ancient Dionysian practice. It's a shame, I feel, because there's so much that we have lost. There is so many different techniques in order to create a state of ecstasy which allows invocation, which allows the God to come through and speak. And it doesn't seem to have been transmitted to people who are working with neo-paganism. It was in the early, sort of when the Alexandrian Wicca came out and the Gardnerian Wicca came out, there was a touch of it. But I think people are afraid of it because you're taking yourself away from your body, and it's actually, it's quite a sacrifice. Because something like, blood control and breath control, abstaining from certain things, it's all almost taking your power away from yourself because you're passing your trust over to the God.
Right, and the ego doesn't like that.
Well, I think a lot of people are afraid of it, and but this is the only way we can connect with the gods. We have to open ourselves up to them and say, yeah, that's fine, come on in. And that's what the whole Dionysian cult were aiming for, to achieve sort of a successful union with the god. And we've mentioned before that earlier in the interview that he was the god of the people, and he was known as one of the most manifest gods. And the reason for that was that he would come through. He would come through the priest or the priestess and he would speak. And that's something, we actually see that in the Oracle of Delphi. And it's interesting because Delphi oracles were originally presided over by Dionysus. All of this the channeling of the god, which obviously now we associate with Apollo. But Apollo, of course, is another aspect where it can be considered as another side to Dionysus. So it's an interesting subject, but it is submitting your consciousness entirely to the God, to allow that God to dwell within you, to dwell within the worshipper. And it's almost like reaching that state of, tabula rasa, so blank slate, a complete blank slate, a vessel for the gods to come through. So ecstasy, when people think about it, they think of sort of reaching some sort of unbelievable
orgasmic state.
Yes, orgasmic state, which it is, but that's the outcome of it. That's the outcome of what the ecstasy allows to happen. So through all these different techniques, so dance and chanting, repetitive sounds, we know that the Dionysian followers would use mask possession as well, so wearing a mask of the god. So you've also got sort of like almost a shape-shifting aspect to that as well, because you're taking yourself away and you're placing something else across your face. You are becoming somebody new, which obviously links to theatre and that sort of thing as well. But, Euripides gives a good example of someone in the grips of like the Dionysian spirit possession.
we don't have to worry about you and other worshippers of Dionysus going around the countryside of England ripping apart forlorn poets. That's not one of the side effects of ecstasy these days.
Well, possibly.
Yeah, it's all for a good cause.
Yeah, it's all for a good cause, exactly. I mean, the same sort of misconception comes about from the word orgy, of course. You know, we're talking about sort of sexual ecstasy and that sort of thing. Because orgy in itself, the Greek meaning for that is celebration of life. We're facilitating a trance-like state to experience the gods or to invoke the gods. So it's working on the same level. So, you know, when you hear about an ecstatic orgy that's going on down,
right,
down
think of a rave or something.
in the local woods, you would think, oh. But the trouble is, you know, that because, as we've mentioned before, a lot of the people who were actually practicing this were on the fringe of society. They were practicing it at night time, they were practicing it in woodland glades or on mountainsides and that sort of thing. You know, this probably only sort of gave rise to the rumours, you know. So you can sort of understand the misconception. But yeah, I mean, entering that trance state to issue oracles, you know, prophetic messages and that sort of thing. But, you know, for many reasons, that's why he's such a successful god of oracles and divination.
In line of this show, Dionysus was obviously essential to the Orphic mysteries, and you write plenty about it in your book. Could you tell us a little about the Orphic mysteries and how they inform Gnosticism and Neoplatonism?
When I first started researching Dionysus, I must admit I was really confused because there was lots of contradicting mythology, in particular sort of the involvement with Orpheus. And, you know, remember I was coming from this sort of from an outside place. I hadn't been involved in the Orphic mysteries. I wasn't involved in Gnosticism. You know, that was all Greek to me.
Pardon the pun.
Pardon the pun. But the interesting thing is that as I was researching, I found that there is actually unification between the Orphic mysteries and what was already an active Dionysian cult at the time. It was already functioning when Orphism actually first appeared, which, as far as my memory serves me, is about 500 BCE. So the Dionysian cult was well away by that stage. Now, as I'm sure all listeners know, it's based around a poet named Orpheus, who was believed to be the son of Apollo. As we've mentioned before, Apollo is often considered as sort of like the more orderly inversion of Dionysus. And the interesting thing is that Orphism, it turns out, was sort of first conceived as an offshoot from the milder Dionysian cults, who would have worked with this more orderly, sort of less extreme aspect of Dionysus. Perhaps for this reason, the Orphics would believe themselves to be more transcendental initiates of Dionysus, so sort of escaping physical matter rather than embracing it. So whereas other Dionysian cults before had actually embraced the physical as a key, if you like, for the mysteries, these transcendental initiates believed that wasn't necessary and that they could reach the god and reach transcendental states without any material influences or techniques.
Yeah, the Orphic mysteries, they were kind of, again, like Orpheus, they were sort of surly. They believed in sort of original sin, reincarnation. Yeah, they were kind of the emos of those days, which later, of course, the Gnostics kind of liked their attitude.
Well, I didn't like to comment on that.
Sure.
I mean, the thing is that it is likely that Orpheus itself is a Thracian name for Dionysus anyway, and it's a Thracian origin by itself. So by this very fact, sort of most of the elements of Orphism, or many of them, originate from some of the earliest forms of Dionysian current. So they are actually continuing on something that's actually very ancient, those of Sabazios and Zagreus. And the thing is, many pieces of mythology are reflected in the Orphic tales and the poems. You know, we see the tales change as such to suit the Orphic's transcendental focus, if you like. I mean, the Earth gods, for instance, the Titans, they possess a bit more of a malignant character as such. You know, they're dismembering Dionysus and punishing Zeus. And obviously from the ash of the punished Titans, mankind was formed. So like you mentioned, Miguel, suggesting mankind was born from an original sin, if you like, although from another angle it could be considered and suggested that our bodies are actually made up of the very gods themselves. You know, it depends how you look at it, really. But these tales became integrated into later writings of Gnosis, you know, and other authors. You know, those tales were woven into the mysteries of orphism sort of around, I think, at about 300 BCE. You know, it's something that we need to be grateful for, because a lot of those tales would have been lost without the Orphic poems.
And Vikki, it might be obvious by now with this interview of if Dionysus might have influenced Christianity, but as you've spoken and in your book, Dionysus himself is a true rising and dying godman. He's a true suffering servant. He's a true friend of humanity from no matter what state he's in. So he definitely influenced Christianity.
Yes, I mean, we know that he, as I say, influenced Gnosticism and also working with Pythagoras, and Gnosticism in itself sort of is seen to have given rise to some elements of Christianity. So immediately we can see those links there. Is Dionysus a dying and rising god? Yes, in some ways. And we know Christianity, as I say, was partly born out of Gnosticism. But I would admit something that I am still studying this particular topic. So, I mean, there's some very, very interesting links there. So watch the space, I suppose. But I think at this stage, it's probably better for people to read my book and make their own conclusions. The discussions there in terms of Dionysus, because the book's about Dionysus and not Christianity. But I think anybody reading the book will see the parallels in many, many forms. In the same sense, you know, Jesus is just as a valid deity as Dionysus, in my opinion, and for all intents and purposes. It's a controversial thing to say, perhaps, for a so-called pagan to say.
Yeah, we can safely say that it was such a cauldron in the Greco-Roman world. Sometimes you don't know when a god starts and another god, ends. They were all borrowing from each other.
Yeah. And depending on the way that, you know, your own personal beliefs, you know, they're either part of the all or they're a separate, you know, and that's down to the individual. So it's really, people need to read the material and sort of make up their own minds, I think, on that particular subject.
Yes, it's like a relationship status symbol with Dionysus. It's complicated. There's never you can't put your finger on them. And Vikki, what happened to the worship of Dionysus? It seems even before the advent of Christianity, his cult had some troubles in the Roman Empire.
Well, I think possibly it was a victim of its own success, I suppose. You know, there were so many branches of Dionysian worship. Especially, as you say, sort of by the end of the Greek and in the Roman era too. You know, while diversity is an element of Dionysus' nature, it also caused a dilution, I suppose, possibly to a point where sort of key elements were forgotten, and some sort of damaging elements, I suppose, were introduced. You know, the involvement of the Orphic mysteries, although it preserved many of Dionysian myths, and it also brought a lot of things to the cult and also to sort of mankind as a whole, like the scientific aspects and astrology and various things, you know, that we should also be grateful for. It also sort of moved the cult away from its core philosophy, I suppose, which was that the material world is sacred and is a key to the spiritual achievement or accomplishment. So, you know, I think that sort of move away from its original focus started to break the cult up. It moved away from that material basis and, of course, away from those keys and those methods for obtaining an ecstatic state, which is needed for invocation, or, you know, in my opinion, a satisfying ritual experience when you feel you have actually made a connection with the god. And I think as well, you know, hand in hand with the elitism of the cult, it moved away sort of from the common person that we discussed earlier towards sort of more selective sort of upper class groups, I suppose. They held their rights in sort of secret societies almost, and they had special requirements for entry. So they moved away from the wild sort of native past of the cult before them. And I think this reduced the footfall because it became quite elitist. the common person sort of missed out. And unfortunately, with that, the cult just didn't become, it became less and less appealing to the wider audience, if you like. In other avenues, I suppose, certain elements of his nature were given too much focus. So sort of like the elevation of elements like alcohol and sexual gratification and that sort of thing coming to the fore. The problem about that is without the other original techniques, there isn't the balance that these techniques gave the initiates or the practitioners. So the original techniques needed for its philosophies were being lost. We're just seeing the things coming to the fore, such as alcohol and sexual gratification, is reflected in sort of later cults of Bacchus, who really is a different sort of character. Bacchus of Rome.
I mean, we do know historically that the cult of Bacchus was outlawed because they were just so crazy and they were seen as breaking the law and being immoral.
And the thing is, Miguel, that's so unlike the original Dionysian rites. That it's so unlike the original Dionysian rituals that you can't consider it to be the same at all. Which is why I stand by the fact that Bacchus, he's got his roots in Dionysus to a certain extent, but I don't see him as the same god, and that might cause a few feathers to be ruffled. But but the practices are so different. So I didn't actually cover him at all in the book. I mentioned him a couple of times, and his name is used as an epithet, as a descriptive name for Dionysus in a certain sort of part of his nature. But I didn't go into lengths about Bacchus at all in the book for that one reason, because I think he would need a whole book about him for himself.
And Vikki, as you write in your book, and also as we've discussed right here, Dionysus is a great, perhaps the premier god when it comes to the arts and theater, certainly a basis for Western culture. I mean, I think Nietzsche was the one who was complaining that we've become too much Apollo and not enough Dionysus. He wanted to see more of that fury and ecstasy from artists, from Western culture. What would you say are some of the other legacies has Dionysus had on Western culture?
I think this is going to sound a little bit radical.
No, from a neo-pagan? No, never.
Never. For somebody who was involved in the club scene in the 1990s, Dionysus is there. And Dionysus is in various, when you watch certain things on television and pieces of music, and I'm not talking about listening to sort of ancient Greek music, I'm talking about modern music. And sometimes you hear something or you hear something and you think, that's Dionysian. And I know there's quite a few people who I know sort of who are involved with Dionysus and practice his rites, which have got sets of music which you would never imagine being linked to ancient mysticism. But Dionysus is a modern god for modern people, and I really do believe that. He is the god of this age. His things which sum him up, those primal forces, have been with us from the beginning, and they will be with us to the end. The needs of life, the things that we need, the things that we crave, and the things that make us who we are. And I think, in terms of legacies, we know his origins, the origins of theatre in the Dionysian revelries. They were processions of Dionysian revelers who would walk through the streets, and they would put on all sorts of silly outfits and silly costumes just to cheer up the crowd, and they would shout obscenities, and they, and it's all about this liberation from what we feel we should be doing, what we have been doing. It's a liberation from ourselves in a lot of ways. And it's reminding us that sometimes we need to step out of the box and just what am I trying to say, Miguel?
No, I think you're saying, yes, we need to get out of ourselves, expand ourselves. Dionysus is a god that breaks boundaries and forces us to reach our potential beyond social norms and all that, whether we're Christian or neo-pagan or anything like that. He challenges us very much like Hecate does.
Yes, and being the god of most manifest, he makes sure we know about it. You know, if anybody works seriously with Dionysus and Hecate, I should also say, you know, you don't get off lightly.
Oh, never.
No, you jump in with both 2 feet, and if you don't, you know, that's it. You're paying for it. You know, they're very much gods of involving you entirely in their worship. And that doesn't mean to say sitting in a temple and lighting 2 candles. This is getting out there, creating music, creating life, and enjoying the world, which is there for us to enjoy. But also, as Dionysus is famously known to say, also in moderation.
Makes perfect sense, and I am certainly a big fan of Dionysus, and I certainly am a big fan of your book, so we hope we can continue getting this god out there, or at least his attitude. But I think that's all the time we have today, Vikki. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio and talking about your new book, Dionysus, Exciter to Frenzy.
Thank you, Miguel.
Before you slip into unconsciousness, I'd like to have another kiss, another flashing